You have to look at it a little differently because their cash crop is the soybeans.
Hi, once again, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Well, today I'm honored to have the president of Comstock Investments, Mr. Matthew Kruse, and he is with us to talk about things related to the Brazilian or South American growing season. And Matthew, thanks for joining us. For those that don't know, Matthew actually has family in Brazil and is involved in farming operations down there. So it's kind of like we get a little bit of an insider look at what's going on down there. And I appreciate you joining us here, Matthew, to explain about the growing season in Brazil. There can be some confusion in that regard. So I assume everything is probably being actively planted right now, right?
It's starting to pick up. October is kind of a prime planting window, especially in the center west region. But they have a pretty wide planting window. It actually extends, I think, quite a bit further than most people realize. It's still relatively early. I think they look to kind of finalize, have maybe 90% of their soybean crop planted in late November. And so they got a long ways to go yet, but most of the focus is mostly on kind of Mato Grosso and those bigger areas, and those they tend to plant a little bit earlier.
Well, and that is such a large country. I think a lot of people don't realize just how wide or how broad that country is in latitude. I mean, it goes all the way to the equator, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it's huge. You have the equator going right through the Amazon region. Brazil is bigger than the continental United States, and so the U.S. is bigger only when you include Alaska, and so it's a very large country.
So now all the focus is going to be turning, now that the U.S. harvest is kind of almost on the downhill side, let's say. Now the focus is going to be turning on growing season weather in South America. Yeah, we all know that they got a little bit of a late start because it was pretty dry there. But let's take a look at the weather forecast that we have for Brazil coming up. Let's take a look at one screen here in particular. This would be for next Monday coming up. And if you would explain what we're looking at on this graphic in relation to where we are in the planting season and what that means right now.
This is just a kind of a shorter term weather model, and basically looking at the short term forecast, and it's a European model, and basically showing that on the short term the weather looks ideal. There's pretty much a precipitation encompassing virtually the entire major growing region belt, from Mato Grosso all the way down south to Rio Grande do Sul, and even on into Argentina. And so it looks like most areas are going to get 2 to 3 inches here in the next week up till October 28th. And so it's areas that need moisture are getting them, and that's kind of why you've seen the pressure in the soybean market.
Now let's move out one more week, shall we? Let's go ahead and take a look here. This is for Thursday, December 5th. So what changes here?
Yeah. I mean, this is an anomaly, weather anomaly, showing the longer you get out, the less accurate they are. That's why a lot of times they shift to the anomaly weather models. But out through basically the whole month of November, it's still kind of showing quite a bit of rainfall in that major center west and central growing regions in Brazil. It's a little bit drier in Rio Grande do Sul there in the south. You can see Argentina in that circle. That's the major production region in Cordoba and the Buenos Aires region there in Argentina. It looks like it's going to get adequate rainfall. The only areas that look that could turn dry here is there in the northeast. You can see kind of the red area there in the northeast. They call that the Mapitobá region, which is just an abbreviation for all of those states. They take the first 2 letters of Maranhão, Piauí, Tocantins, and Bahia, and they call it Mapitobá. And you add that production together for those areas, and it's about 10% and of the total production in the country. And so it's too early to say yet if the market's going to react to that, but Overall, I think it might shrug it off, because as long as Mato Grosso and some of the bigger areas are getting rainfall, it might kind of shrug off some of those smaller production regions.
Now, you always have to think about it. We're in the southern hemisphere, so everything is flipped from what we would be used to here in the U.S. So I would imagine that all the planting is going to be taking place first in the northern latitudes, closer to the equator, correct?
Yeah, yeah. In that where you had your cursor there, that Mato Grosso in the state of Paraná is usually where planting kicks off, and so I think Mato Grosso is probably 20 to 25% complete already. Paraná, which is a state further in the south, is nearly halfway complete already, and so it's speeding along rather quickly. We had another graph that kind of showing the planning pace, and you can kind of see where we're following along with the historical trend. And so we are behind. We're probably a week behind schedule when compared to what their historical pace is, but it's starting to accelerate to the point where, I mean, they could easily plant 10% a week, and probably it's going to be closer to 15%, I think, per week going forward, meaning that they like to have 70% of their crop in by kind of late November. And I still think that they could catch up there. And so while they started late, the bottom line is they could still end on time. And so, that's kind of where it's out there.
Well, we hear a lot of talk about the monsoon season, the monsoon in Brazil. Explain what that is and what the time frame is for that.
So there's a very distinct rainy season and dry season in Brazil and in South America. And so they're just referring to the monsoon. They're just referring to the rainy season essentially. And so when it's just a seasonal weather pattern that I mean, literally from roughly May to September, it doesn't rain at all. Like, it's bone dry, and you get 90 to 100-degree day heat a lot of times in some of those areas, especially in Mato Grosso. And so the ground, it's kind of a sandy loam. It just turns to concrete. And so of course, their growing season coincides with that rainy season. And so that's, it's still Mother Nature. You kind of know, like late September, October, that rainy season is going to begin, but is it going to be again on time? And so that's what growers are always looking for, is when is that rainy season going to start? And so they could theoretically plant in, late September. I think, around September 15th is when Mato Grosso is authorized to begin planting. But it's still kind of early. If it was raining by then, they'd be planting. But it was starting to get, a little bit delayed. And so that's why the market, at first kind of perked up there. We had a little bit of rally. And that's when, Comstock kind of noticed that. We made some advice on making some of those sales on that rally. And we argued that as soon as it starts raining, or even get rain in the forecast, that the market is gonna collapse on us, and that's exactly what happened. We've given up $1 here in the last several weeks, and so but as long as it's still early, there's a long growing season yet to go. The December, January is probably more the critical time frame when a lot of those beans are filling their pods, and so there's a lot yet that can be happen.
The thing that was so telling to me on that particular graphic was the fact that 70% of the crop goes in during that, what is that, a 7-week window. That's a large majority of the crop. So, and that starts like on October 6th. So, I mean, really, we're just barely getting started in that. And they have big equipment there too now, right?
I mean, there's places in Mato Grosso, like I said, on the western side of the country, they're going pretty hard. But they're, on the northeast, your eastern side of the country, they haven't planted anything yet. So it's a little bit early, but yeah, as long as the rain in the forecast continues strong, I mean, they're going to be going pretty hard. And so they're going around the clock at this point.
Let's take a look here at the soybean production areas. You have indicated here on this particular graphic where the big areas are. So explain this. Obviously, right here, this area right in the center of the screen kind of jumps out. Which state is that?
Yeah, that's Mato Grosso. I mean, that's the largest production state in Brazil. Probably what most traders look at to kind of gauge how the crop is going, just because it has the biggest influence. But you can find soybeans now spread out all over the country. Now, you go back, the traditional growing areas are that Paraná and Rio Grande do Sul there in the bottom center. That's considered the south part of Brazil. Right there. Now, you go back 40 or 50 years, and all of the soybean production was just in those 3 states there in the bottom. And today they account for less than 30%. And so you can see how all the growth, there was virtually no soybeans north of those 3 states, back in the 70s. And so you can see how all the growth has shifted there further north and continues to shift that in that direction. And so the South, it's not insignificant, 29-30% is still a large percentage, but their influence is definitely diminished. And so, but you can see in the darker green areas, this image comes from the FAS, Department of Agriculture. And so you can see how those darker green areas are where the soybean production is heavily concentrated.
Wow, that's fascinating, because I did start farming in the 70s and 80s. And now that you mention that, I think back, and all we ever used to hear about was Rio Grande do Sul. And so now it's more of a minor player. That's intriguing. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the agriculture there is still very strong. It's just it's a lot smaller farms. It's very more expensive and saturated market. And all those large farms that you hear about, they're all the ones further in the north in the frontier. They're in Mato Grosso and other areas.
Well, let's look at how that compares then to the corn areas. All right, here's a map of corn. It looks fairly similar, doesn't it?
So there's technically 3 different corn crops in Brazil. This map kind of throws them all together. And so you can see, I didn't distinguish between the 2, but you can kind of see again how important Mato Grosso is, that you have a third of the corn production in Brazil is coming from Mato Grosso. So it's a very important player. The state that my family farms in there is Minas Gerais, and you can see they only make up 7% of the production. Most of that is coming from the first crop. And so the first crop of corn is being planted right now as well. And they're actually probably overall, they're about halfway done in the country, and should finish up here in the next 30 days. But the first crop corn is a lot smaller. It makes up less than 20% of Brazil's crop. And so the market doesn't give it as much attention because of that. The main part of their production comes from the second crop of corn. It's close to 78% of the overall output that Brazil produces. But they don't start planting that until January. The growing season for that is January until July, more or less.
Is that considered winter corn?
Yeah, they have different names for it. The winter crop, the second crop, the small crop. They call it the Safrinha, which is the little harvest, because it used to be the smaller crop. And then as they've expanded further north, they realized that they almost looked at it more as a rotational crop, that they had enough window following the soybeans that they could get a short season corn crop in. And so they call it the little harvest. They didn't get very good yields, and based, if you compare it to Iowa production, they still don't get very good yields. But the fact is, they're doing on so many acres now that it adds up to a lot. And so, I think the overall production average is less than 100 bushels per acre. And so in Iowa, we would kind of scoff at that yield, but they're doing it on 40 plus million acres. It makes a big difference. And so, so now that little crop they still call it the little harvest, but it's become the big one. So by far.
Well, and then you have to consider that's after they get a soybean crop off of that. So
that's right.
In the U.S., you would, for example, think of maybe harvesting wheat and then putting beans after that.
Well,
but here they're putting soybeans and putting corn after that.
You have to look at it a little differently, because their cash crop is the soybeans. And so I always tell people that a lot of them, even if they knew they're only going to break even on that second crop of corn, it's still worth it to them, because in their mind, they're doing it so the soybean crop that follows it will yield that much better, following corn in the rotation, rather than avoiding it and just doing soybeans on soybeans each year.
One thing that I was curious about, and one thing that we always get questions about, is the USDA estimates for South American production. And that debate seems to just never end, and it goes on and on and on. And you have actually put together a graphic of how far apart USDA and the Brazilian equivalent of that, called CONAB, how far apart they are. Let's take a look at that here. And here's an example. So last year, you can see how far apart they were on the corn and the soybean estimates. But man, next year, I mean, it's just a huge gulf in estimates for production. So explain this.
Yeah. Well, first off, the thing that, calls to my attention is that the trend is widening, right? It's not narrowing.
Yeah.
Every year it seems to be getting worse for the last 5 years. In the 2019-2020 crop, it wasn't that big a deal. But every year that gap seems to be getting wider, and it doesn't seem like we have a real good answer as to why, unfortunately. I think both sides are kind of dug in, and CONAB believes that their numbers are right, and the USDA is wrong, and the USDA believes they're right, and CONAB is wrong. And I think most traders still gravitate towards the USDA, just because they're seen as kind of the gospel, right? They're the most largest, most well-funded, research organization for this type of thing. But I think as Brazil grows, CONAB's influence and what they estimate is also grown as well. And so it's just kind of interesting, that they don't have to reconcile these gaps, that gap in the 2022-2023 season, that it never closed, and so it's possible they could still make some adjustments, several months later yet to last year's crop, but and it's still early for the 2024-2025 season. Those numbers can change yet, but the point is that it's interesting how they just can't seem to get closer together, and they're getting further apart, and neither side wants to give in. So,
do we ever really know who's right?
Not really. Everyone has their bias, I think, and I'll admit I probably have a little bit more of a bias to wanting to lean towards CONAB, just because they're there and they're more local. But I've met other traders and analysts that strongly believe much more so in the USDA. That I think they would argue that USDA has better kind of the satellite technology, and they have their own people on the ground that can estimate these things too. And so I think what I look for a lot of times, the truth is, what are basis levels doing locally in Brazil? Because if the basis is strengthening, it would kind of indicate, well, maybe there's not as many ending stocks there as previously thought. And if there's not as much ending stocks there, did they really produce that much, is what the USDA says. And that's something that we've been seeing happening, that that the basis levels have been unusually strong for this type of year. And how do you explain that? And one potential argument would be, well, the crop wasn't all there, like USDA said. Another thing is, we hear reports that Brazil is importing soybeans from neighboring countries. Now, maybe it's relatively small volumes, but they're technically record volumes from countries like Paraguay or even Uruguay that they're importing soybeans from. Well, I mean, if they got this big banger of a crop, according to the USDA, why is the largest soybean producing country in the world importing soybeans? I don't quite understand that. And you're also going to look at the exports. The more Brazil produces, the more they're going to export. Less they produce, the less they're going to export. And so Those are some of the things that we look for, I guess. But other than that, I don't have a great answer for you as to why that gap is there. I think you just have these two entities that are kind of entrenched into their own methodology, and the conversations that we've had with the USDA in the past is and kind of similar to how they estimate the U.S. crop size. They have their methodology, they're confident in it, and they're not going to change it. That's kind of the message that we got. And so I think they kind of apply that same methodology to Brazil.
I know over the decades, I've always heard a lot of people openly speculate that if there is any room for error, the USDA tends to always err on the size of cheaper food. So that means higher production estimates. If there is any discrepancy at all, I don't know if I can argue that case or not, but that is an argument that has floated around for many, many years out there too.
Well, you don't really have any proof of that, but it nobody does. But it certainly does seem always to work out to their benefit in that case, right? That they make adjustments later on, months or a year after the fact, that to kind of keep the food inflation in check.
I would like to invite you. I don't know if you're willing to do this, but considering you're kind of our insider in Brazil, and you have just family connections and everything there, would you be interested in talking with me maybe once a week now that we're into the big planting season there and the growing season, to give us an update on what's going on there, since you have firsthand knowledge of it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I usually go there after Thanksgiving, so I'll be there most of December and January. We didn't do a kind of the standard Brazil tour trip this year, just because we have some other things that I'm working on as well. But yeah, I'm happy to share more information and give people updates on how the farm is going down there.
Well, if you can find a good internet connection down there, let's kind of plan on that. And we'll do regular updates direct from Brazil,
Yeah.
from boots on the ground, and you can let us know what you're finding out down there. Man, that would be awesome. So
Yeah,
I would
that's
encourage
the
everybody
challenge,
to
is getting good
stay tuned.
Wi-Fi sometimes.
Yeah. So anyway, everybody out there watching and listening, keep checking back here, because we're going to be having just live updates, or about as good as live, from Brazil later on this growing season. And we'll get it straight from the horse's mouth instead of from USDA. All righty, Matthew, thank you for joining us. Appreciate that a lot. I look forward to talking with you next time. Matthew Kruse, president of Comstock Investments, with us today with kind of a primer, if you will, on the growing season in South America. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.